What I'd like to do today is take you through real quick through a history of different types of dewatering technology that was used at Disney and Reedy Creek for projects. It evolved over the years. We have to do dewatering. In Florida, our drinking water is 5 to 8 feet below the surface. So if you dig, you dig during the wet time of the year, you're hitting water. So we have to do it. And a lot of ours is from pumping. We have to pump the water off the site. But the same treatment systems would apply if you had it free flowing off the site by gravity. It's just a difference in mixing. That's all. All right, so let's get going. Just a couple of definitions. By definition, dewatering operations are those practices that we take to manage the discharge of any pollutants other than stormwater flowing off our site, and we have to remove them before it's carried out. And ultimately, we're trying to get the sediment to drop out. That's what this is. As a general rule, there are 3 types of dewatering systems. There is a rim ditch or a pit. You dig a hole, drop a pump into it, whatever the water's in the bottom, that's what comes out the top. A sock system, which is a trenched-in high-density polyethylene pipe wrapped in geotextile, usually put around the perimeter. You need a little bit of sandy soil to pull that through. It works pretty good. And then the well point system, slotted PVC pipe jetted into the ground 10 to 25 feet, pulls the water through the soil, doesn't produce a lot of volume, but produces very clean water. And on a big project, you might have all 3 of these systems going on at the same time. So again, a little more detail. The rim ditch systems are typically going to produce the dirtiest water because unless you're working totally in sandy soils, the water is usually disturbed from clays or organic materials. It usually doesn't meet the water quality standards for the area. In Florida, we have a water clarity limit of 29 nephelometric turbidity units over background. So about the time the water gets to be 30, 35 NTUs, it's not legal to discharge it, and your eye can only detect it about when it gets to 25. So it doesn't look very cloudy, and it's not legal to discharge in Florida. It's usually cheapest up front for a contractor to use this because he just digs a pit and drops the pipe in, but if you get into an enforcement situation or you have to try to hold the water, it's usually very expensive to fix it at the end because people paint themselves in a corner and have to build these above-ground pits, and they always blow out. Next one's the sock system. Again, I told you that trenched-in pipe system. It produces pretty clean water. It's usually installed around the perimeter of the project, hooked up to a pump. It's a little expensive up front, but it's almost a one-and-done. You're done with discharging that. And then a well point system gets you the cleanest water. Almost always looks like drinking water coming out of it, but it's not a lot of volume. Kind of gurgles into a manifold system. It's usually put in an excavated terrace fashion, but a lot of municipalities now use them in linear projects, streetscapes, things like that. And usually the water is clean enough to discharge down the storm drain if you have the permission of the MS4 owner. It's challenging to keep the water clean. Even when you're doing the right thing, as the picture on the left, the guy has clean water coming out of the pipe. He's got a splash pad down. He's got a floating boom in the water. It's still challenging to keep that water clean. Once the turbidity starts coming out there in the bottom right picture, it's pretty visible. It's easy to see it. It's kind of like blood in the water for sharks if the agency is active in doing enforcement. And then once you've blown the whole site, you're causing damage. It's a mess. There are plenty of citizens groups, agencies, and everything else who are monitoring. A lot of citizens groups are tired of hearing the excuses. They don't care. Riverkeeper, Sierra Club, places like that, they're out there monitoring. Everybody's got a digital camera. Everybody's willing to photograph you and send it off to somebody and complain. So it's very difficult to get away with doing this. In years past, people thought they could. Not anymore. All right, so what's the big deal about a little muddy water? Well, muddy water does a number of different things. First of all, as it gets cloudier and cloudier, it blocks sunlight. Blocking sunlight shuts down photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is needed in water to produce oxygen. A lot of organisms we care about, fish and other things, need oxygen to survive. Fish fry, when they first hatch, are very delicate. They can't swim against the current. They can't navigate their way. They usually have to sit and attach themselves to a rock or a plant or something for several days while they absorb that egg yolk sac that was from when they hatch. If they get beaten to death with sediment and large particle sizes, they die. If this happens repeatedly, that fish species disappears. And over time, you can see fish that everybody wanted to catch disappear, and other fish that will survive there, a little hardier fish like in Florida, a freshwater would be a gar or a mudfish, being replacing sport fish, and that can happen in fresh or salt water. The way you measure turbidity is with a nephelometric turbidity meter, which is essentially a computerized flashlight. Take a sample, put it in the jar, in the container, clean off any drops, drop it in, push the button. The computer measures the light intensity from one side of the glass to the other, converts it to a number. Higher the value, cloudier the water. If you've been to any sessions over the years for training and developing all of these sediment basins, they work great in sandy soil. If you have clay or muck soils, they don't work. It's mud in and it sits there, and then the next rain event, the volume comes in and pushes the mud out. Maybe it's a little cleaner if you use a skimmer off the top, but it's never clean enough usually to meet state standards, and people don't really know what to do. So years back in the 1980s, we resorted to using a chemical to treat it that was already used in drinking water facilities, aluminum sulfate. We'll also talk a little bit about the anionic polymers. Alum is used in potable and wastewater facilities to drop out particles, to drop out sediment. It makes a very light, slow settling particulate, and it needs a quiet pool in which to settle out. That's why wastewater plants have these large circular lagoons, drinking water facilities, etc. It works pretty well. It's inexpensive up front. It has some issues with pH. Pure alum is a pH of 4.1, and if you're not careful and you burn off the alkalinity in the water as you treat it, it will start getting acidic. Once it gets below a pH of about 5, you start having impacts to aquatic life. So alum has to be used by somebody who knows what they're doing. You can't just go throw it in the water. You'll have really clean water and everything dead. However, it was what we had back then, and so we had people that were trained on how to use it. This is an example of a project where they used the alum to treat a concrete particulate discharge. They were doing a bridge deck demolition where they brought in a high-pressure machine that jetted 15,000 pounds per square inch water and blasted the concrete off down to the rebar. Now, it made a milky alkaline discharge that was over 300 NTUs. Remember, we want to stay around 30 or less in Florida. So what the contractor, and I didn't even know this, the contractor and I had an agreement. I thought it was no big deal. They said we're going to blast off a little bit of water and we're out of there because the people doing the work didn't think it was a big deal. But the contractor said, you're going to make this chalky mess. You don't want that going in your water. So he came up with this idea to redirect the water instead of letting it go off on the little inlets that usually drop off the bridge to drain. He blocked those, directed the water down off the bridge deck into an area where he had a drum of alum, and it's not coming out of that hose very much. It's coming out at about half a cup a minute. Half a cup a minute's not a lot of flow. Then it's going down the paved flume and mixing with the chemical. Mixing is important with chemical treatment. He also put some 2x4 batter boards in there just to get more turbulent mixing and to trap any large chunks of debris that might come off from that blast effect. And then he had dug 2 small pits into the side of our drainage canal and lined them with plastic. So it's mixing with alum, coming in at about 300 NTUs, and then going in here where we're going to get some settling effect. Okay? Comes in at 300, drops down to 30. That's a order of magnitude decrease. So at 30, we're almost where we'd like to be for discharge, but let's see if we can get it a little bit cleaner. So now he then has a pipe that skims off the top of the water, cleaner water, and goes into the next cell. Okay, the next cell gets a little more time. Again, we almost cut it in half. We're down to 17 NTUs. That's pretty good as long as our pH isn't an issue. Final discharge comes out of a pipe, flows across the grass, and then back into the receiving water behind a floating boom. We do a check. The receiving water is 15 NTUs. By the time it goes through the grass, it cleans it up a smidge more. We're down to 10 to 12 NTUs. That's pretty good. Now let's make sure our pH is okay. He's checking it. The receiving water pH is 6.6. This is 6.7. This is discharging 6.6. We're okay in this instance. So this was a good treatment system that was maintained and operated and did a good job. Again, here's some numbers. I'm going to show these a few times, then I'm not going to repeat them for things. But for 15 days, this thing treated almost 96 million gallons of water total, and it was able to remove 95% of the turbidity for less than $1,000. So contractor thought that was a pretty good cost-effective system. In the early 90s, we found another material. I went to a conference International Erosion Control Association conference, and there was this material called anionic polyacrylamide, this long name. I get school kids to say it, and it sounds funny, but its short name is PAM. So anionic PAM, because there's an anionic, a neutral, and a cationic, and you only want to use the anionic PAM, has been around for a long time. It has been around since the 40s. It's been used in a lot of food and agricultural products. It's also used in drinking water and wastewater facilities to clear things up. The food grade material only uses the anionic, and these are just the specs of the food grade. You don't have to memorize that. But you want to always only use the same material that they use in food grade and water treatment. If you stay with that, then you're not going to have any issues with toxicity, because there's always a company wanting to sell you a generic or a lower quality. Look, you save money. You don't save money. You're going to have other issues. So the anionic polymer, again, is already used in water treatment. It's used as a thickener in juice. It's in cosmetics. It's an animal feed. It's used in pulp and paper mill. It's been around a while. Its history is that going back to the 1940s, when the Allied troops were trying to make a push through Eastern Europe, they were getting their convoys bogged down in the winter spring thaw mud, and they used this as a thickener. It drove the water out of the soil and made it behave more like a wet sand, which they could then get their vehicles across in. After World War II, the Department of Agriculture did a lot of research, university research, on the uses of the polymer as a way to reduce erosion on farms, because they were often irrigated by flooding the fields, and when they did that, it would blow away the topsoil, pick up pesticides, nutrients, etc., and cause problems. Well, what the Department of Ag found out was that the polymer did a real good job at reducing erosion. If you keep the soil in place, you keep everything else in place, all the fertilizers and everything else. That makes sense. It also tends to keep the soil's pore structure open. It doesn't make it different, but if the soil was draining pretty good before, this doesn't form a crust. It actually holds it open and allows more water to infiltrate, which gets down to the roots, which is better for everything else as well. And as long as you stayed with the anionic, they saw no toxicity effects, which is good. EPA has done a real good 7-page review of this product, and I brought copies of the EPA document. This is not an endorsement by my company. This is what EPA said on using the material. If you want them, when I'm done, you can read up on it. The anionic PAM is also one of only 2 chemicals allowed to be used in your 2017 construction generic permit for chemical treatment. Now, I realize every state has to get approvals, and you should. When we were at Disney and Reedy Creek, we researched this for a year, talking to different people, getting papers, doing some tests, having our scientists look at it and everything before we decided to do a small case study and move on. But it is a very valuable tool if you can get the ball moving with everybody to look at. It is a very useful tool. So there are anionic polymers, neutral polymers, and cationic polymers. Fish gills have a negative charge on them. If you remember, likes repel and opposites attract. So if you put an anionic polymer on an anionic fish gill, it'll repel. If you put a cationic polymer on an anionic fish gill, it'll go right to it, and it causes asphyxiation. So you want to stay away from the cationics. They're used in industrial applications. They're useful for that. You don't have fish swimming where those things are. So stay with the A grade on the polymer. There's also differences in whether you use a generic polymer or a polymer optimized to match the soil. You optimize it by changing some of the charges on it and adding different little elements like calcium and different things like that. But if you see here in this picture, there's no treatment. That's a generic. That's better than that. But if you use an optimized, it gets even better. You get a larger flocculant that behaves like a sand particle. Sand drops out real quick. We're pretty good with that. Also, companies that sell you this material will do a free test for you. They'll do a jar test to match it, and they'll say, you need this version of the A-grade PAM. Your water came in at 500 NTUs, and when we were done, it went out at 10. So you have performance results, not, I hope this works, I know this works based on lab test results. Also, companies that utilize this should do toxicity testing. That satisfies the regulatory agencies. It's the same toxicity testing, acute and chronic toxicity testing done in our drinking water. The anionic polymer comes as a concentrated liquid emulsion that can be poured into a water wagon used for dust control or used in hydroseed, hydro-mulch applications. It comes as a powder, which can be put out on roads for dust control or used to stabilize slopes prior to rain events. And the one I want to focus on is the gel block. It's a 9.9 hydrogel material, kind of like soap on a rope. It's designed to dissolve at a controlled rate, and you put it in water and it doses the material in there just enough to get the job done, not an overdose. It forms these sticky agglomerations of polymer and sediment that both settle by weight and will attach themselves to a natural fiber like jute, coconut, or burlap, and they will stick on there in high flow conditions. That's how you can harvest this material back out of the water. The cheaper open weave jute actually works better. That's the jute, and that's the jute with the polymer agglomeration on it. And when it gets filled up, you just lay down another piece and keep going until you're done with the project. So this is a rain simulator from the University of Central Florida in Orlando, which has the largest rainfall simulator in the world. On the right is untreated soil. On the left is treated soil with the polymer. They're simulating an 8-inch rain event. Notice the color of the water coming off on the right versus the left. When they scoot up, look how much material is coming off in the pan on the untreated, which you'd expect, but look on the left. Very little is coming off from that. This has the ability to stabilize your slopes prior to you putting down vegetation. It's also very plant friendly. Remember, the Department of Ag looked at it. They weren't going to be putting materials out on farms that are poison. That's kind of self-defeating of their purpose. For turbidity management, it can be set up as either a flow just based on rain events where it passes through the storm system or a treatment ditch, or you can set up and use pumps and pump it over the blocks. Again, once the material comes in contact with the sediment, it's going to cause it to drop out, and you can see it getting clearer and clearer here in the flow. It also has the ability, as I showed in an earlier presentation, to do fairly dramatic. This is a turbidity contamination from a marine sediment that we were trying to use for a different purpose that got away from the contractor. We had it trapped in the canal, fortunately, and we used one polymer block and pumped it over 24 hours, and it's pretty dramatic. Boom, now it's heavy, it's dropped out, we're done. So what I want to try to do now, and depending on the time I've got left, to give you a couple of examples of projects we did. I may not be able to show all of them, but I'm going to run through them. First one was our first use of the polymer blocks in Florida on a dredging operation in a boat marina. They were supposed to tell me before they started, but they didn't. They waited until they muddied up the entire 8 to 9 acres of boat marina and then said, oh, fix it. And I'm like, well, thank you. You made my job easier. They were pumping the water through a series of settling basins and roll-off tanks, but it wasn't settling out because the organic material was behaving weightless and repelling charges. So we did some tests and got the polymer to where it would actually start to work together and drop out, and that's it. Pretty much there in less than 60 seconds. That's our first polymer block, pumping into there, getting the polymer in contact with the turbid water, and then we run it through the settling tanks, and we had good results. We put some floating turbidity curtains there. It actually baffles, redirect, and deflect the water, and that's before and after treatment. And again, we were able to knock 99% of the turbidity out. Again, for less than $1,000, no impact to the fish, which were in the boat marina. And that was a good enough first test, kind of under worst case scenario, that we decided to continue to pursue using this technology. This is an example of a treatment system that was set up in an emergency. They were doing an expansion of the Magic Kingdom, and they were using alum to treat into a pond roughly the size of this room. Again, remember, alum needs a quiet pool to settle out in. We got a 2-inch rain event. The whole pond fills up with water. That means there's no extra capacity for the water to settle out. So they had to shut down the alum treatment, had me come out, set up a mixing trench, which I just set up some leftover pipe and plastic. Those are the polymer blocks. And then they hooked up the pumps to it. You can see the water coming in very, very turbid, very agitated, mixing, 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 mixing. And then as it goes downstream, I'm going to pass it over some jute. And that's, you can see it, clear water over the top of the jute. And then it would discharge right into a wetlands. But again, we were able to get it down to below 20 NTUs and able to continue. Again, at the end, it was 99% reduction. That's in an emergency treatment, not able to design it, just set it up real quick. 400 gallon per minute flow. There are vendors who have gone one above in creating mixing systems. This wasn't done by Disney really quick, but you tell a vendor, hey, I need something to mix this up. There's a very creative Scottish engineer that made this small treatment system, an electric pump, about the size, inside of a box about the size of a big ice chest. And he had a name for it called a lip vax, which meant something, but I won't worry about that. So again, another boat marina operation, muddy water. Did some jar testing, determined we need to use that. This thing only pumps at about 200 gallon per minute, very low flow, but it also adds high concentrations of air, which aids in the mixing, and mixing is important. So this little unit, the water intakes, passes through here. The polymer, instead of it being a block, was made into sausage links, which fit inside the pipe. Fit right inside the pipe. That maximizes mixing. And so again, you can see the water getting a little cloudy there. That's the flocculation forming. And 16 hours later, the water was clear. We had another area that had to add a little extra treatment for it. We just moved the system. So set it up and move it, set it up and move it. At the end of that, we're good. We're done. Very dramatic results. The nice thing I like about that system is it's small enough to have a portable water treatment system that fits in the back of a pickup truck. So if you had a water line blowout in a park or something come up as an emergency, you can plug this thing into a generator or an electric and set it up, get the right polymer in it, you're good to go. It also comes in versions where they add extra manifolds on it. Again, that's just for passing more water through it. Again, same concept, polymers inside, gets good results. We used it at one time when a water line blew out and made the water all messed up around an existing pond, and all I did was go out there and set it up, plug it into the restaurant next door, walk away from it, next day it's done, unplug it, take it apart. Very effective. Another system came up for design that used some series of different types of mixing systems. They dug a compensating storage pond next door to an existing lake. We had it boomed off, but if you've ever been out at Disney, people rent these little boats and drive them all over the place. Half the time, these people have never been in a boat in their life driving it, so they run into everything. So the question was, are we going to wait a month while this settles out and hope they don't run into our containment system and cause a breach, or let's go ahead and treat it and settle this right out? So we decided to go for that. Now, this lake was pretty clean, 3 to 5 NTUs. Your drinking water is just below 1. So we did some testing. The testing predicted we could get it down to about 5 NTUs. I said, great, let's do it. So they wheeled out this new contraption, which essentially was a mixing roll-off container that you could put into a truck trailer. And it fit on here. This little contraption had a lot of features. It had a secondary mixing system. It had a series of baffles all through it. It had a spillway. It had a skimmer. And it had reusable capture devices made from coconut instead of the jute. And so we set the system up. Again, you can see some of the particulate captured there in the jute, in the coconut, but again, we needed then to add the jute. You can see it captured the clear water sheeting off. After 4 hours, we had dropped it from about 80 NTUs down to about 60-something. And after 32 hours, the water was back to background, just like the lake. And we actually exceeded our target. The lab test results predicted about 5. We were able to get it below 5, which is pretty good. If you consider that's not a lab test, that's out in the real world. Again, the costs are relatively inexpensive. And the last thing I'm going to show you is an example here. Disney's expanding Star Wars in Hollywood studios, and they need a lot of fill material. So they found some sandy area. They started excavating a pit on about a 20-acre site. And they dug this pit like 30 to 40 feet deep in places. And then we had a tropical storm come along and dump 12 inches of rain over a 3-day period and filled that whole pit up with water. Now we've got 300 million gallons of muddy water that wants to discharge to our protected wetlands. Oh no. So again, they used some of those in-the-pipe treatment systems. These are a little larger systems that, again, they're in a series of 2, but the polymer blocks are inside these little V-shaped areas. And again, they're sized for a 4-inch and 6-inch pump. Another vendor has that. You just call them up and say, I have a 6-inch pump, and they run it right out to you, and you hook it up. and you can connect 2 or 3 of these together. They also, this is the first time they utilized a portable flock capturing pit made of the plastic traffic barricades and a liner. They set that up. That provided more surface area for the jute for capture. And there you can see it there. And got it hooked up and got it going. And they were discharging 12 NTU water within 5 minutes of setting that system up. So again, as a summary, chemical treatment options have improved over time. The anionic polymers have the lowest toxicities that we've been able to do that, including verified with data. Again, we had a laboratory that monitors all the water quality, so we don't just go with what the vendor said for that. New technology has a small footprint. Most of these treatment systems are about, they would fit in an area about the size of 2 of these stages that I'm on. The environmental rules set up by EPA promote using good sound systems, and the contractors are routinely using these systems in their designs and in their SWIPs. If you need more information, again, I have the EPA handouts here. And before we go, I'd like to show you a real quick little test. So if I could get 4 people come up here for just a second, you're going to help me out. If you don't, I'll walk over and bother you. But just come right up here. I'm going to make mud and clear it up right in front of you. It won't hurt. Oh, good. So this is some soil Marlena got for me from, I think, from the road up near North Shore. So I'm going to pour some water in it, make mud. Yeah, 3 or 4. So let me dissolve this up here. No, you don't want to drink it because we don't know the history of the soil, right? You don't know what happened to that soil. You don't know if a bear did his thing in the woods. So let me just make mud. And if we measured this, I will tell you already this would probably be somewhere between 200 and 400 NTUs. Now the heavy stuff, I can hear the rocks settling the bottom. We don't care about that because that drops out, right? It's the light stuff we care about. So let me give a little bit to Marlena. Good. A little bit here. Don't fight over it. And one more, just to make sure. All right, so if you guys would stand up here next to me because people can't see you when you sit down. All right, so we have our turbid water. This could be our pond, our settling basin. These are plugs out of those polymer blocks. This one I know has been tested to work with small particulate clay soils or these soils here, and I guessed correctly that they would work with the soils here because I can't bring soil with me into Hawaii. And I'm going to take a small piece about the size of a pencil eraser and drop it in each cup. Don't do anything yet. All right, and everybody tell me what's happening. I'll tell you. Nothing. Not much because we're not mixing, right? Mixing, those mixing systems are important. So I want everybody to grab the top of your cup like this. Imagine we're later on in today at an adult beverage place celebrating our new knowledge that Marlena and everybody brought to us, and we're swirling our drinks. So this is our mixing. Almost sling it out of the cup. So we're going to go for 30 to 60 seconds. While we're doing this, the polymer is dissolving, going across the water column, interacting with those tiny particles. Some of it is being collected through charges. Some of it's just physically intertwining as the particles and the PAM interact. They are doing that snowball effect and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And once we get to a certain point, it will have enough weight to drop out by gravity. So we'll do the kid countdown thing like I do with schools, like a rocket. I'm from Florida, right? So everybody with me? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Stop mixing. So we'll kind of walk around and show people what's happened. This isn't magic. This is engineering. The hard work's been done in the polymer. What you've done is made the very small particles now behave like a larger particle. Right? So just kind of show everybody. And you'll also notice that that piece of PAM I dropped in there is still there. In fact, it is increased in size because it swells up with water. That little piece I broke off is enough to treat 50 gallons of water. Okay? So we drop this in our basin, we skim off our clean water. These particles would stick to something or stay on the bottom. We're good to go. Keep doing that. Easy peasy. All right? So unless there's any questions, I'm done. Thank you.